Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment. But in the past, everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load. These machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it. And that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, this DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day, where every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, Group Policy Objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines, authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So, we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right, So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'm gonna give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's gonna be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right. And so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator. And basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right, and so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker, somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power. But here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL. And when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody. It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers. But not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where, cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section, we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. So with the creation of virtualization, it got companies thinking. Companies like Amazon and Google and Intel and IBM and eventually even Microsoft that, hey, we've got these massive data centers. Why not allow people to pay us to host their virtual machines on our data center? So in other words, we can get people to pay us money to host their virtual machines, and they don't have to deal with all the headaches of dealing with everything on premise. So this is really the idea of where cloud services came from. And so I'm going to draw this kind of big cloud here. This is going to represent cloud computing, if you will. And we'll have a connection coming down here. Okay. And I will just kind of clean that up a little bit, make it somewhat look nice. So this being, the big thing is this is not a new concept of, if you think about humans as a whole, we have offered services for years. I know how to change the oil in my car, but I don't necessarily enjoy doing it. So I can pay a mechanic shop the fee, and they will do it for me as a service, right? Well, this is the idea of cloud services. So there's some acronyms I want to introduce you to. The first one being the term IaaS, and that is infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service means the cloud provider is offering their infrastructure for a fee as a service. Okay, so the idea being something like this: instead of me having to host my virtual machines and all that in my on-premise environment, I can pay this cloud company to host virtual machines for me. They can also host a virtual network for you. They can host they can have storage that's offered to you. They can have firewalls, virtual firewalls that are associated on those virtual networks, and virtual load balancers. Okay, they can have apps out there that are available. They can have virtual databases that are hosted in the cloud. So essentially just about anything you could imagine that you can host on premise can be hosted out there in the cloud service. Now, Amazon, Google, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, these various companies offer this Microsoft's cloud service that does this. Their IaaS service is called Azure. Now, let me just kind of clarify. You may pronounce that word a little different than I do, Azure or Azure or Azure. Actually, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I actually went to the internet and started watching videos of the developers that created Azure, and the first few developers that I watched, that's how they pronounced it. They pronounced it Azure. So that's how I just assumed that it needed to be pronounced. Of course, I learned later down the road that not all the developers even agree on how to pronounce that word. Some of them pronounced it Azure, Azure. I've even heard somebody pronounce it Azure. So this is one of those tomato, pronounce that word any way you want to pronounce it. That's how I say it, which is Azure. Okay. So Azure is Microsoft's official infrastructure as a service. And the way that it all works is you pay a fee for what you use every month. Basically, how much CPU, memory, storage, network, all of that you use, that's what you're going to pay for. Okay. Now, there are some other terms, acronyms that I want to introduce you to. There is an acronym called PaaS, which stands for Platform as a Service, and an acronym called SaaS, which is Software as a Service. Now, the idea there being that there are, well, we'll start with Software as a Service first. Software as a service, the idea is that there is a fully functional app or application that is 100% ready for you to start using, or your users to start using. All you got to do is just jump right in and start using it. Okay, so there are some Azure services that are software as a service. There's also what are called platforms as a service. Now, platform as a service is kind of there's a little bit more work involved from an admin standpoint. So a platform as a service means there is some type of software platform that is available for you to start using, and it's 100% ready for you to use, but you have to go and administer it and use it before it's going to really do anything. A good example of this is Microsoft's directory services in the cloud is called Intra ID. Intra ID. All right. Which I want to make, it's very important that you realize that this was formerly called Azure AD, and there's still a lot of documentation out there that refers to this as Azure AD. So it's very important that that you are aware of that. Now, you are taking my course right now, and you should realize that I have hundreds of hours of videos that that I've got to update that involve that term Azure AD. There are literally hundreds of hours that I have recorded using the term Azure AD, and I'm in the process of updating videos, but be aware that I don't have them all upgraded. So you may hear me refer in the course to stuff as Azure AD. I actually have a video on this for you to watch after these foundation videos. It's a video that says do not skip. So please do not skip that video. Make sure you watch that video because it's going to talk about this name change. So anyway, the name is now Intra ID. It's just a name change. They've changed it to Azure AD. The services are pretty much all the same. It's just a name change. Okay, so Intra ID is a platform as a service. Now, it is Microsoft's directory services. This is where your user accounts and passwords and groups and permissions, role permissions, and all that are all managed through Intra ID, formerly Azure AD. Okay, whereas on-premise in a domain, we called it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. All right, and I think that's part of the reason Microsoft changed the name, to kind of distinguish the difference between the on-premise Active Directory and the former Active Directory, Azure AD, to Intra ID. Anyway, this platform as a service is ready for you to use, but there's only like one user, and that's the admin, and then you're responsible for going in there as an admin and adding users and controlling things. That's why it's a platform as a service. It's not 100% ready, set up. You have to administer it. Now, Microsoft's main platform as a service functions and software as a service, they have something called Microsoft 365. So there's really two parts to the Microsoft Cloud Service. There's Azure, which is mostly focused on the IaaS side of things. And don't get me wrong, in Azure there are also some platform as a services and software as a services, but it's mostly geared towards IaaS. Whereas Microsoft 365 is mostly geared towards platform as a service. Now, these two are very related. Microsoft 365 sits on top of Azure. You can't have Microsoft 365 without Azure. And if you create an Azure account, then it'll allow you to automatically create a Microsoft 365 account. So these are all related. You're not just going to create an Azure account or not just going to create a Microsoft 365 account. They're pretty much linked together. Okay. Now, in the Microsoft 365 services, you have lots of platform as a services and software as a service. For example, we have what are called the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, which that was formerly called Office 365, and that's the downloadable version of the Microsoft 365 apps, formerly the Office 365 apps like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of that. And there is also something called Office for the Web. Now that is fully a software as a service. The Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, that is actually a mix. It's a platform as a service and a software as a service. Most people refer to it as a software as a service because they're downloadable apps. But as an admin, from an admin standpoint, we have to administer that. So the administration side of it is platform as a service. Office for the Web is 100% software as a service. These are web-based versions of the Office apps that are ready for your users to use. Once they get a license, they can use it. Okay, then we have Exchange Online. Okay, so the administration side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service, right? And then we've got SharePoint Online, which is the same idea. It's a admin side is a platform as a service, but the user side, which is what most everybody focuses on, is a software as a service. We have Microsoft Teams, same thing for that. Okay, for messaging and all of that fun stuff. We have a product called Intune, which is an incredibly powerful product. Mobile device management, mobile application management. Intune is what is sort of taking the place of GPOs in the cloud. So on premise, we could control the settings and parameters and attributes, and we could deploy software and all that using GPOs on premise. Well, now when it comes to the cloud service, we can use Intune. We can actually control on-premise machines from Intune. So it is very, very powerful, an incredibly powerful product. Then we've got OneDrive for Business. OneDrive for Business is a cloud-based storage that users can have access to. So anyway, there's actually so many products that are cloud-based products. There's no way I could put them all in here, but here's some of the main things. Now, as far as the licensing and all of that, with Azure, you are paying for what you use, CPU, RAM, storage, and network. But for the Microsoft 365 services, you have what are called subscriptions, and you purchase a subscription with a certain amount of licenses. So, for example, if I purchase a Microsoft 365 subscription, I can purchase a certain amount of licenses, and I can issue those out to my users, and I will pay a monthly fee for however many licenses that I've got with my subscription. Okay, and that's just giving you a basic understanding of how that works exactly. Okay, so ultimately, though, if I could kind of color code this, we'll say that the Azure side of this, IaaS, and again, Azure does have some platform as a service stuff as well as software as a service, but it's mostly geared to be a infrastructure as a service. And then the Microsoft 365 is mostly platform as a service, software as a service. So if I was to kind of draw a, kind of just draw around these, we would say that these right here are all geared towards Microsoft 365, and then these are geared towards the infrastructure service, which is Azure. And both of these, Azure and Microsoft 365, they share intra ID. They share intra ID. Okay, yellow or red and blue make purple, right? Okay, so they actually you create users in the Azure side or the Microsoft 365 side. You're going to see the same users because they are linked together. They share the same directory service, so it's important to understand that. Now, the other piece of this is, what about situations where you want to link all this together? So it's not uncommon nowadays for companies, to have this triangle, to have this on-premise domain, and then also start utilizing Microsoft's cloud services. And then, for years and years, they've always pushed this thing called SSO. SSO is single sign-on, where you have a user has a user account, and that user account gives them access to everything they need. Well, we don't get SSO if you have to have a user account to access things in your domain and then a different user to access things in the cloud, right? Well, Microsoft has ways around that. They actually have services that you can use for linking these together. And that service, let me just kind of move some of this around a little bit so I can make a little bit more room. We'll put the DNS server there. We'll move this little RAS server down over here. And the server is called Microsoft Intra Connect. And it was formerly Azure AD Connect. Okay. So again, it's called Intra Connect now, and it used to be called Azure AD Connect. And I like to refer to it with the old name as well, just because, be advised, you really kind of need to know the old name as well, because there's still a lot of documentation that will refer to this as the older name. The newer name is Intra Connect. The older name is Azure AD Connect. But this was a server you could set up on premise, and what it would do is it'll synchronize your user accounts out to the cloud. So your on-premise user accounts would get synchronized. So whatever users you have on-premise, and you don't have to synchronize them all, you could pick and choose which one you synchronize, but your user accounts are going to sync out to Intra ID. And now what will happen is you have this thing called seamless SSO, where when your users log on to the domain, it logs them on in both places. They log on to the on-premise domain as well as in the cloud, which is really, really cool. Now that is a heavier weight version. There is actually a lighter weight version that's a very, very lightweight application. You don't actually have to dedicate a server to it like they kind of want you to with Connect. There is actually another lighter weight tool called IntraSync or Intra ID Sync, which is a lighter weight. Now there's some pluses and minuses to go in either route, which I'm not going to get into right now. But the traditional way to do this was to use this here, IntraConnect, formerly Azure AD Connect. Now the other thing I'll tell you is this does not sync back. So it would sync users out, but it won't sync users that are created out in the cloud back to on-premise. You cannot currently do that. You can't synchronize users that are created in Intra ID down here. But any users can be synced out, and it'll even make it where if they change their password, like out in the cloud, it'll sync that as well. So anyway, that kind of gives you a rundown of that. Now, I'll also tell you that Microsoft is moving away from domains. In fact, if you if you've got an on-premise domain like what you see here, then yeah, it's a great idea to utilize this. But if you're a new company, and this really pains me to say it because I have fed my family for over 2 decades by not only teaching about Active Directory on-premise, but also implementing Active Directory on-premise as a consultant. And so it kind of pains me to say this, but as a consultant now, I'm not even recommending that newer companies implement a domain anymore. A lot of companies are now moving to the cloud, and there's ups and downs of that. But to be honest with you, in most cases, your company gets out cheaper by utilizing cloud services. Okay. And so nowadays you can actually set up on-premise machines and manage them through Intune and things like that that are in the cloud. You can even have client machines hosted in the cloud, but I'm not going to dive into that right now. Ultimately, though, if you are a company that's been around for a while, then the traditional approach that you see here, where you've got a domain, and then you're starting to move into the cloud, you can set up IntraConnect, formerly Azure AD Connect, or Intra ID Sync, and which is the lighter weight version, and you can have things synchronized out to the cloud. All right. All right. Well, hopefully these foundation videos have been instructional to you. I hope you got a lot out of this, and you're ready to move on. Now, as we move into this material, I want to clarify something, and that is that the Microsoft Purview portal has been going through a transition period. Where it's transitioning from what they call the classic view of the Purview portal to the new view. All right. So here we are on admin.microsoft.com. And if I click show all and I click compliance, that's going to bring me into working with Purview. And of course, at that point, if it's the first time you've gone here, you may see this screen here where they're showing you the new portal. And then you've also got the classic portal. Right? So you got the new portal, you got the classic portal. We are going to be explicitly focused on the new portal, not the classic portal. I do want to warn you that Microsoft changes this thing about every week. So you need to be advised that as you go through this, your screen may not look exactly like my screen. But the main thing is to focus on the concepts, and also you got to get used to that Microsoft changes things almost weekly, and there's no instructor, no course that is going to be perfectly up to date with every little possible change, because there's just no way to update things that frequently. In fact, Microsoft's own material, their screenshots and all of that in their actual official Learn documents are out of date as well, in terms of just being able to keep up with the amount of changes that they're putting in. So this is just part of our life as admins. We got to get used to change, and this is one of those things that's going to be changing very, very frequently. Okay, so once I go into the portal here, I'm just going to click Get Started, and at that point, they got this little tutorial they want you to run through. You can just kind of click Next through that. But at that point, I'm now officially inside of the new portal. And the new Purview portal. And then what I can do is, as we go through things, and occasionally I'm going to ask you to look for things over here on the left. There's not really a lot going on this sidebar, but if you click on solutions, you can see the various solutions. For example, if we go into information protection, you'll notice that that'll show up here on the left. But just always remember that solutions, you can always find things through solutions. A lot of times too, you'll hear me say just click on information protection and you can get to things like data lifecycle management or data loss prevention. You'll be able to get to those, but you also can go up here and click on solutions. So that's how you're going to navigate through that. Now, before you can jump in and really start protecting sensitive information in your organization, you need to first identify what sensitive information requirements your organization has. So the first thing we'll look at there is going to be what types of sensitive information exist. So one of the main types of sensitive information that organizations a lot of times will have is called PII. That's personal identifiable information. Okay, this is going to include names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, any type of information that could be used to identify someone. This could end up leading to identity theft. That's going to be PII. So we want to identify that. We want to have ways to identify that and identify that in our organization. All right. The next is financial data. This is going to involve credit card numbers, bank account details, income, tax information, any type of financial record that your organization keeps on hand. Next up, we have health information. So this might involve PHI, protected health information. This will be governed by the HIPAA laws, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. All right. So anything involving health, medical, you're in the medical industry, that's going to involve this. The next is going to be intellectual property or IP. This will involve trade secrets, proprietary business information, any type of software code, or any type of confidential information that is specific to your organization, that your organization has created. Next, we have classified government data. So this is going to involve sensitive data that must be protected according to government regulations, such as with FISMA or NIST. FISMA being the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, and NIST being the National Institute of Standards and Technology. All right, so especially, depending upon what government you're involved in, especially though in the United States, these are all things we have to consider. The last being confidential business information. So this will involve things like your company's corporate strategies, any types of mergers or acquisitions that might be happening, some type of legal proceedings, or other business operations that are specific to your business. That's going to fall into that category. So next we have understanding the data sensitivity levels. So the idea being that with data sensitivity levels, we have to consider things like information that is available to anybody in the organization or maybe made available to the public or only specific people. So these will get into things like security clearances and all of that. Or again, you can call them data sensitivity levels. So the first being labeled as public. This can be basically freely shared public information. This is information that could literally go on our company's website, and we don't have to worry about it being sensitive at all. The next being internal. Internal is going to be intended for internal use. These will be for employees. There might be some limitations as to certain employees getting access to some of this information. All right. For example, you might have an intern or a temp employee, and they may not get access to certain internal types of information. Next, we have confidential information. So this will require this is going to be protected data for sure, and you'll have to keep people who are unauthorized from gaining access to this. So this is going to involve some sensitivity for sure. And then lastly, you have highly confidential, restricted, or sometimes referred to as top secret. This is going to be data that, if disclosed, could cause significant harm to our organization. So this is going to involve very sensitive information, trade secrets, maybe if you're in the medical industry, private health data, things like that. All right. So those are some of your main types of data sensitivity labels that a lot of organizations use. So the next thing we would consider here would be the legal and regulatory compliance of all of this. And depending upon what country you're in and all that, you may have different regulatory compliances, but a lot of different countries, and of course here in the United States, we use the ones you see here. The first you have is called GDPR. This is General Data Protection Regulation. And the idea here is these are going to be regulations that are processed, that are going to involve processing of personal data within the EU, the European Union. That's going to involve things like information collected in a certain country must stay within that certain country or within the organization and not be transferred around or sold or any of that. The next is the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. This is actually the original act made in California that sort of led to the GDPR that you see above. This is, again, a law regulating how businesses collect and handle personal data in California specifically, but a lot of places have adopted that due to the GDPR. You then have HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is going to involve, again, the medical industry, regulations involving protecting health information here in the United States. And then FISMA, you have the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. This is going to involve laws that are ensure government agencies protect sensitive information. And lastly, you have PCI DSS, that's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. These are going to involve standardized rules and regulations for how credit card transactions and data and all that is collected and maintained as well as managed. So those are some of your legal and regulatory compliance. So the other consideration here, of course, is the tools and techniques that are going to be used for identifying sensitive data. All right, so there's various ways, various tools and techniques that can be used that is going to make life easier as far as discovering what types of sensitive data we've got. One is data classification. So data classification is going to involve labeling and setting sensitivity levels. So there's actually ways we can do scans, we can look for keywords and patterns in data, and then based on keywords and patterns and signatures and all of that, we can decide whether or not certain data should be classified. We can then have classification and sensitivity labels that we set for labels or levels, either one that we set. All right, and don't worry if you're not completely clear on labels versus levels, because in the end they can be the same thing or they can be broken up different, but this is not something we'll dive deep into in this video. But anyway, that's one of the things about classification. Data classifications allows us to we can do some auto searching or manual labeling and classifying of our data. Then we've got DLP, data loss prevention. Now, the goal of data loss prevention is to protect against any type of unauthorized leak of information we don't want to be out there, right? So these are going to be technologies that help us detect, monitor, and then protect our sensitive information and prevent them from being leaked out by unauthorized individuals. All right. Third, we've got encryption. So encryption is going to be used to protect sensitive information and to protect it when it's at rest or in transit, meaning, data being at rest, meaning it's just sitting on a hard drive somewhere, data in transit, meaning it's being transmitted across a network, right? So we want to have encryptions. And there you'll find that there are different types of encryptions that are used for different, those different methods. Some types of encryptions are going to protect data while they're just sitting there on the hard drive, and then some will protect data as it's being transmitted. Okay, sort of just a couple examples would be like Microsoft has EFS, encrypting file system, encrypt files while they're sitting on a hard drive, and then we use things like HTTPS, which uses TLS encryption, transport layer security, which is going to be used for data while it's being transmitted. But not to dive deep into that, just throwing that out there. The last thing you'll see there is access control. These are going to involve permissions and monitoring or auditing of data. So basically we can control exactly who can and cannot get to certain types of information. All right. Next up, we've got data governance and management of policies. So with that, you'll see that
you got to consider the fact that we want to be able to implement policies for how we want to restrict and classify our data, and maybe control how long we want to keep our data and all that fun stuff. So the first thing you'll see there is having data classification policies. And this is going to define how data is going to be classified and who exactly will be able to access based on the classification levels. So again, this gets into things like having top secret data or business confidential or whatever labels you want to set. And then from there, you would restrict who exactly has that level of security. The next would be retention policies, and this is going to involve things like how long data should be kept before it gets deleted. And that's one of the, school of hard knocks lessons that companies have learned over the years, in which they have gone through the process of storing data for decades, and then that data gets leaked. And next thing you know, somebody has had their identity stolen, and maybe this person hasn't even done business with the company in the last 20 years. That's kind of sad when you think about it. Next thing you know, you got a lawsuit on your hands, and you're being sued by somebody that hasn't even done business with the company for 20 years because we've held on to their personal data. It got compromised, and now their identity was stolen. The last thing there would be incident response plan. So this is coming up with a set of policies on if there is an incident, if there's some kind of a data breach or a leakage of data, this is going to be how we respond. Coming up with a plan of action and knowing exactly how we respond. Okay, so those are going to be your data governance and management policies that a lot of times are going to be used within an organization to protect your data. Okay, so the last thing we've got here is assessment and risk management, and that is going to involve being able to go through and assess the actual risk that we are willing to take on. Is this a high level of risk with data we're collecting, or a low level of risk? So we're going to do what's called a risk assessment. So risk assessment is going to go through and help us identify vulnerabilities related to sensitive data, and we get a feel for, okay, what kind of sensitive data are we talking about? Is this data that if stolen we're going to get sued? These are things we got to consider, and so a risk assessment is going to be used to do that. So we're going to be doing things like monitoring for emerging threats, with all that, maintaining security protocols, enhance vulnerability assessments, implement robust security measures. We're going to have various things in place. Now, it's also going to involve what's called threat modeling. Threat modeling is going to be identifying potential threats to our sensitive data so that we know exactly what security measures we need to put in place. Okay, so one of the things we got to consider is when we do our risk assessment, what all types of data have we collected? What is considered sensitive? And then what threats do we need to be worried about here? And that's what threat modeling gets into. For example, there might be some new type of a threat that's out that involves just medical information. So you're periodically going to have to reassess everything and say, okay, well, there's this new type of hack where people are stealing medical information, and they're using that medical information for XYZ reason. And we would want to be reassessing and going back through and modeling what types of new threats we have to consider. So that's the idea of threat modeling. Okay. All right. So hopefully that now gives you a better understanding of going through, identifying what personal information is, and then some of the just sort of a high level view of the tactics and techniques that we're going to use in order to protect our organization's sensitive information. I now want to jump in and take a look at sensitive information types with you and see how we can create and manage our custom sensitive information types utilizing Microsoft Purview. Here I am on admin.microsoft.com. I'm just going to click Show All. We're going to go down here to Compliance. Okay, you can also just go straight to purview.microsoft.com and go here as well. All right, so this is the new Purview, the newer Purview portal. They are changing this thing, like it feels like almost daily, so don't be surprised if yours looks a little different than mine. The main thing is you want to learn the concepts, and then you can learn your way around all this. Okay, now I'm going to go up here and click on Information Protection. And there is a little drop down called Classifiers. So I'm going to go ahead and click that drop down, and then I'm going to click on Sensitive Info Types. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pull that up. Sometimes it takes a few seconds. And then from there, you will see that Microsoft has literally hundreds of built-in sensitive info types. So Microsoft 365, right out of the gates, already has the ability to identify hundreds of different types of sensitive information across the various platforms we have within the Microsoft 365 space, as well as Azure. Okay, so lots and lots and lots of stuff there that I can take a look at. I can click on these. I can learn more about them. They've even got the ability to do a test to see if you can find a piece of sensitive information in a document if you want, just by clicking Upload File. Now, what if, though, so even though there's hundreds of these things, what if I would like to create my own custom one? What if I want to create a brand new one that's not listed here? What if I wanted to combine some of these together? Well, that's where we're going to go up here. We're going to click on Create Sensitive Info Type. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll click the little button, and sometimes this does take a little while before it pops up on the screen. All right, and then once it does pop up, it's going to ask, what do you want to name it? All right, I'll just call this Credit Card Info for ELP, Exam Lab Practice. And then, of course, it wants you to give a description. I'm just going to paste the same name in for that just so it doesn't take long. So I'm going to click Next. And then at that point, it wants us to create a pattern. So how is it supposed to decide if there is a piece of sensitive information, if it's scanning a document or whatever's going on? So I just click Create a Pattern. Now, what is the confidence level? Now, if you look here, they tell you this is the confidence level. This reflects the confidence of the match, which typically increase when supporting elements are detected, along with primary elements. This is going to involve things like we're going to have a primary element like the credit card number, and then maybe supporting elements like a date or something like that. So the more supporting elements there are, the higher confidence there's going to be. So you can set this to what confidence level you want it to flag something as based on what it finds. Okay, so I'll just say medium confidence. And then from there, primary element, what do we want our primary element to be? So there are some different options. One is regular expression. So regular expression is where you can put in a string of characters, like for a credit card number, however many characters there are on a credit card number, you could put in that's the pattern you're looking for. Another option, instead of doing regular expression, or regex as they call it, regex, you can do keywords. So you could search for a specific keyword. Perhaps you are looking for a situation where somebody has leaked payroll information out to some of the employees, and you want to search and find the keyword payroll. You could do that. So you just put a keyword in here. Now you could also do an entire list of keywords. You're doing what's called a dictionary list of keywords. So, you could have a separate line, and you could have hundreds and hundreds of keywords there. So that's the idea of using a keyword dictionary. And so the last one you got is a function. Now what that'll do is that'll actually let you combine this with some of the existing built-in patterns that it already knows. So I'm going to go with that one, and I'm going to click Choose Function, and we're going to look for, it'll start with the word func, F-U-N-C. I'm going to look for a credit card. There we go, function credit card. So I'm going to use that as my primary element. Search for credit card. So instead of me having to define a new pattern using a regex, I can just use some of the existing ones. So I'll click Done, and then from there we'd want a supporting element. Well, let's do a function for that as well. And we'll do within 300 characters, that's the proximity. And then we'll go down here and let's search for the keyword date. All right. So there we go. We can do expiration date. Click Add. Click Done, and at that point we've got our supporting elements. We can add additional supporting elements if we want. That is something you can do. You can have it look for groups of any of these, all of these, or none of these if you want. So I could put that in as well as another supporting element for that, but I'm not going to have to do that here. All right. Let's see. So I've added the credit card number. I do believe that I accidentally deleted my expiration date, so we're going to want to put that back in there. Let's fix that real quick. There we go. Add, done. All right. Now we're going to click create, and we've got our pattern. Notice that we wanted to add another one. We could add another one, right? You can see a summary by clicking the little arrow, and we're going to click next. All right. Now you'll notice here that this is medium. These two are grayed out. Now the reason for that is because we selected this as a medium priority. If we switch that to high priority and click update, you'll see that now high is selected. So this is reflected. Eventually they're going to probably change this whole screen, and by the time you watch this video they probably have. So don't be surprised again if this looks a little different for you. But I'm going to click create, next, and then I'm going to click next again. It gives me a quick summary of everything I'm doing, and then I'm going to click create. All right, so here we are submitting it. All right, so it doesn't take too long usually to create, but I will warn you that it can take between 5 minutes and 60 minutes before it can really be used in your organization. And if you are a worldwide organization, you've got resources scattered through various regions of the world, it can take up to 24 hours before this can really be used. So just be advised on that. So I'm going to go ahead and click done. And at that point, you'll see that it is trying to populate here. And I'll just put the word credit in there. And there it is right there, credit card info type. So I can go ahead and click on that. All right, you can see it'll bring me into it. Some of the details here. So far, you'll see that nothing's been detected. We haven't done any we haven't implemented it really. We haven't implemented policies or any of that, right? But you can see that it is right up here, and that it is available to me to at least go in and take a look at it. I can also edit that. If I wanted to edit it and make some changes to it, I can do that by clicking edit. All right, now I've got a little Word document that I've just put a little fake credit card in there. This is not like a real number. It's just an example number with an expiration date. I've saved it as credit card example, and then I'm going to click test, and I'm going to upload the file. All right, so I've done that. You can see the file there. We're just going to click test. It's obviously not very much data, so hopefully it doesn't take too long. But as you can see, it says we have detected the following information here. You'll see low unique. So the primary was found, medium, and then high. So it's because it's showing the supporting elements. So it all three of these were a hit, which means it's really high. We'll click finish. And at that point, we've tested it. And so we know that it does work. All right. So that is how we can go in and we could create our own little sensitive info type. So again, I can just go right over here to sensitive info types. You can see the list there, and I kind of encourage you to feel free to jump in and look at some of the sensitive info types that are available, like customer ID, for example, is a good one. You can click on that, get a look at it, click edit, get a deeper look at what the patterns are, and you can familiarize yourself with the various sensitive info types as well as the various patterns. Let's now jump in and talk about the concepts of document fingerprinting in the Microsoft 365 services. Now, before we can really implement it, we need to understand what it is. So let's talk about that. So Microsoft has some official documentation that you can peruse. If you go out to Google or Bing and just search for the keywords Microsoft 365 about document fingerprinting, you'll find this document right here. It talks about document fingerprinting and what it is. So this is a great feature that is a way of basically analyzing documents and building a template from those documents that then becomes a sensitive information type, a SIT, in other words. And this is great in situations where you have documents that are reused over and over and over as sort of like templates that contain sensitive information. And these documents maybe are passed through the company, but maybe they're confidential to the company. You need a way to put restrictions on anytime Microsoft 365 notices one of these documents. Okay, so to do that, of course, you're going to need to utilize document fingerprinting. All right. So this is great. This works in conjunction with Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams. It can work with your endpoints themselves, with the Microsoft 365 or Office 365 applications. You can base it on low, medium, or high as far as its detection goes, and you can have restrictions. And of course, you create your document fingerprints utilizing the system I'm going to show you here in just a second. But then, of course, you can put restrictions and all that using DLP, which I'm not diving into in this video, but as you get into DLP, you'll learn that. Data loss prevention policies. All right, so that's the idea. Now, here's just a quick little example. They show a patent example. So maybe your organization works with patents, and so they've got a little patent document. So it breaks it into patent and title, then inventors, and then description. And so what happens is you run this through the document fingerprinting algorithms and all that with sensitive info types, and then it builds this sensitive info type with utilizing Microsoft's algorithm, and then from there it's able to detect when it sees the same types of information further in. All right. They do mention limitations. Document fingerprinting doesn't detect sensitive information in the following cases, like password protected files, files that contain images only, documents that don't contain all the text that the original form used to create the document fingerprint, or files larger than 4 megabytes. Now, this number right here will change. By the time you're watching this video, this number could change. But ultimately, whether it's changed or not, it's the same concepts. Okay, you can use the graphical tool to create document fingerprints. You can also use PowerShell, the new -DLP sensitive info type. If you want to look deeper into the PowerShell side, check out this article, and they give some examples of doing that. All right, now what I want to do, let's jump over and take a look at the actual graphical tool, and how we would manage this through Purview and all that fun stuff. Okay, so if I go over to admin.microsoft.com, click Show All, and then go down here to Compliance, that's going to bring me into purview.microsoft.com, which of course you could just type that in directly and get there, right? And then from there, I'm going to click on Information Protection. We're going to go to Classifiers and then Sensitive Info Types. All right. Now, what I'm going to do here, I've got a Microsoft Word file. Here is Microsoft Word, and I've got a Microsoft Word file example that I've got created here. Example, Microsoft 365 document fingerprinting. I've made this sort of like a template, but also I've provided you with some valuable information. It talks about what document fingerprinting is, example. The key thing to think about here, though, is it's going to be analyzing things like these headings that you see here, the names of these different headings, and then some of the sensitive information that it's discovering in these. So like, for example, I've got my name here, John Christopher, an address, and then a credit card number. So those are obviously some sensitive pieces of information. So again, the headings and the sensitive info, that's what we got. So I called this document doc fingerprint example. All right. So that's set up. Now we're going to go right here to create fingerprint based SIT. All right. And I'm just going to call this fingerprint. Let's see, fingerprint credit card info. And that's going to be what I'm going to name it. You don't actually have to put underscores there. I'm just going to do that. All right, so we'll click next, and then we're going to click upload, and I'm going to upload the file. Okay, from there, you'll see the file shows up right here, and then it's got the confidence levels. These are numbers that Microsoft's algorithm has come up on its own, as far as 30, 50, and 80 being, these are just the defaults that they've set here. for confidence level. Now, the numbers themselves, they don't exactly mean anything particular like spacing or any of that. This is just part of their algorithm. This is a ranking system that they've set, that they've come up with on ranking something low, medium, and high. And obviously, you can alter this. You can choose between any of these if you want. So if I wanted 40 to be considered, 40 and above would be low, and then 50 and above high. Maybe I set that to 60 and above, and then maybe this is going to be 90 and above. I could do that, right? Or I can just go with the defaults that we've got here. All right. So that's the ranking system. Again, it's just a system they've put in place. There's nothing special there as far as like, the distance between characters or any of that. That's all part of their algorithm, and this is the numeric system they've created. All right. So from there, we'll click next. We get a nice little summary of what we're doing here, and then we click to create. So then at that point, you can see that it's now officially been submitted. All right, that normally takes between 15 and 30 seconds or so. And then once that's done, you'll see this here. We'll click done. Now we'll scroll down and we'll locate our document fingerprint sensitive info type that we've created. I think I just passed it actually. Yeah, so here it is right here, fingerprint credit card info. So you can see it's labeled as a fingerprint. All right. And we could click that if we wanted to. We could even edit it if we wanted to, upload, all of that stuff. All right, now there is another piece to all this that we're not diving into in this video, and that's going to involve when we actually get into using the data loss prevention policies in conjunction with it. So just be advised on that. This is just simply how do we implement the fingerprint sensitive info type. So that was the point of what I wanted to get across in this video, and we're now ready to move on. I now want to get into EDM classifiers. Now, EDM stands for exact data match. So let's dive in and take a look. Here we are on admin.microsoft.com. I'm going to click show all and go to compliance. And you are going to notice in a lot of my videos, I'm going to have you start from the beginning like that, and then I'm going to take you straight to where you need to be. Now, this may be annoying to some people, but I find that a lot of people forget how to get places, and so I like to go back through and review as I start new videos on how to get somewhere. Also, I have people that skip around, so they sometimes miss the beginning where I show how to get somewhere. So I find this to be valuable to people. So that's why I do it. So here I am, though, on purview.microsoft.com. I'm going to click Information Protection. All right, and then from there, we're going to drop down where it says Classifiers, and we're going to click on EDM Classifiers. Okay, so EDM Classifiers, you'll see here it tells you that exact data match classifiers use exact values from your org's data to detect matches instead of generic patterns. They can then be included in several compliance solutions. So imagine a situation where you have some very sensitive information that you need Microsoft 365 to be monitoring for. For example, maybe we have the company's corporate credit card, and there are, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 people in the company's financial department or whatever that have access to this, and we want to make sure that we're tracking anything involving that corporate credit card. Now, this is just an example. Obviously, you can the sky's the limit on what you could use this for, but that's just my example. Now, I can go right here and click on Create the EDM, and then it'll tell you the steps, essentially. The first being prerequisites. You need to discover and prepare your sensitive data. So in other words, you need a sample, and that is a requirement. You got to have a file containing the actual sensitive data that you want the classifier to be looking for. So for example, they give, if you want to detect patient records, your file might contain data for patient ID, name, in our case, credit card info. And then there's a second file that they highly recommend, which is a similar sample of the data, but not the exact data. So what I have here is a little spreadsheet that I created with some information in it. John Christopher, Visa cards, fake credit card, fake address, all that stuff. And I've saved it as a file called EDM required files, or file. And it's saved as a .csv file. All right. So now what I'm going to do is they tell you that you got your data. All right. You're going to create your EDM classifier. You got to upload it securely, and then from there you can test it, all that stuff. But I'm going to click on Create EDM Classifier, and I'm going to call this John Christopher Credit Card Info. All right, I'll just copy that and make that the description as well. We'll click Next. So then I can upload the file, or I could manually define the data structure without having the actual file. In my case, I'll upload the file, so I'll click Next, and then I'm going to click to upload it. All right, so as you upload it, it takes just a few seconds, and then of course it's able to detect the information that's in the file. So from there we would click Next, and then it tells you select your primary elements. So what is it you're primarily going to be looking for here? It says choose which fields contains the main sensitive information you're trying to detect by identifying them as primary elements. Map these fields to sensitive information types such as social security numbers, credit card numbers, what exactly match your sample data. To further improve the accuracy of your matches, identify fields without a SIT, sensitive info type, as a multi-token or single token. So I'll just go down here and select, this is going to be my primary element, the credit card number. We're going to go ahead and click Next. Now it says configure settings for data in selected columns. You can apply settings to all columns in your schema file or configure different settings for each column. Use the same settings for all columns. So I've got that information in the file. I'm just using that. Then we got data in columns are case sensitive. So we can have that selected, or we can turn that off if we want. Okay, ignore delimiters and punctuation. That gets into, is comma separated value. That's to delimiter the commas, so we're going to ignore that. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. All right, and then from there it says configure detection rules for primary elements. Each primary element can contain up to 3 rules. Now in our case, we want this flagged as high confidence level. This detects supporting elements within this many characters of the primary elements, 300. So if you got the credit card number and you got the expiration date, it's within 300 characters, it's still there, it's going to be detected, it's going to show up as high. Of course, you can edit this if you want. From there, we'll click Next, and then we're going to click Submit. Now, let me warn you about something here. Once you submit this, even when it finishes, this can take a few days before any of this is available. So that's one of the downsides with working with the EDM classifiers when it's replicating across the organization. At least at the creation of this video, it could take a few days before this is actually something you can use. But there you go. That's how we can add a EDM classifier.
Let's talk about a feature that we've got available to us known as Trainable classifiers. Now, what is Trainable classifiers? This is a feature that is available to us in Microsoft 365 that allows us to gather a bunch of documents together that are used in the same category. For example, legal documents. Maybe you've got a bunch of legal documents in your environment and you would like to have these certain types of legal documents classified. Or maybe you are in a more sensitive environment. Maybe you're military or something like government, and you've got some sensitive documents that a lot of these sensitive documents maybe have the same types of information in them, and you would like to have the trainable classifiers recognize that content and then automatically classify that content for security reasons or compliance reasons, all of that. So that is exactly what trainable classifiers is going to let you do. You're going to be able to gather a bunch of documents. You're going to actually need about 50 samples of these types of documents, and you're going to have the trainable classifier AI actually analyze that information. Could take about 24 hours, believe it or not, for this to run through, depending upon how big the documents are. Okay. Once that information has been gathered up, you can build your classifier policy so that it's able to utilize that in things like retention labels, sensitivity labels, and communication compliance policies. All right. Now, let's consider a few things with this feature. First off, the licensing requirements. You have to have at least a Microsoft 365 E5, Office 365 E5,
compliance feature in order to have this capability. So you got to make sure that your license, of course, is going to support it. Secondly, the permissions. The global admin needs to basically opt in for the tenant to be able to create custom classifiers. And all that's going to involve is just a little message that's going to pop up when you first go into it. You just got to agree to it. Another option, another thing you can do here, if you're not a global admin, you can assign a compliance administrator role. And the compliance administrator role will have this capability to handle these as well. All right. Something else, if you're going to be using this for different scenarios, there's the three main scenarios: retention labels, sensitivity labels, and then communication compliance policies. You need to consider what roles can be assigned to do this. So retention label policy method, if you're going to use that scenario, you have to have record management and retention management role. With sensitivity label policy, you can use a security administrator, compliance data administrator role. And then communication compliance policy scenario essentially is the insider risk management admin and supervisory risk administrator. So to have full functionality on those three things, you need to make sure that whatever user is dealing with that particular scenario, that you've got that role. Of course, if you're a global admin, then you're fine. And then one last thing of note here, by default, only the user who creates a custom classifier can train and review predictions made by that classifier. So if you're the global admin or whatever, you go in and you set 50 documents to be analyzed for a custom classifier, you've got to be the one that goes through and reviews the results of all of that. Unfortunately, you can't pass this on to somebody else. At least as of right now, you can't. All right, so here's a quick timeline. And the big thing to understand here is that this takes time. This is not something you're going to do within a few minutes, and it also involves you got to gather a lot of documents up to try this out. So here's an example, though. You have the 12 days of start. The first day it says basically the first time you're opting in to use trainable classifiers. All right. Once you've basically opted in, you got the license, you've opted in, you can now start collecting documents. You'll need to collect at least 50 documents. Okay. And then as far as the indexing of those documents, it's usually going to take about a day. Once that collection of the trainable classifier indexes, once the AI, the artificial intelligence, is done, you can then go through a testing process. And basically they recommend about 10 days of testing. That's where you're going to take about 200 documents. Yeah, that's right. You're going to need 50 documents to seed all of this, and then they recommend having about 200 other documents that are similar to what you're looking for, and then you're going to test all of it to see what the seed information is able to find in these new documents. All right. Once everything's good, you're happy with it, it will let you fine tune it, but if you're happy with it, you can publish it, and then you can make it available to things like retention policies, as they're showing you here. So this could take a month, over a month, in order to get this the where it needs to be. And that's because of using the machine learning. It's going to take time for that machine learning to go through it and be able to do all that. So a couple other facts with seeding content. You're going to select the content. So a human being is going to do that. You're going to grab the content you want this thing to seed, to actually analyze and gather information on. You need at least 50 positive samples and up to 500. Okay, it'll let you do up to 500, and you can grab that information. Keep in mind the more of that information that you've got, the more files you've got that you're actually analyzing, the longer this is going to take. Okay. So that is what the idea of trainable classifiers are. It is kind of a long, drawn-out process to set this up and configure it. It's for somebody that you're going to need to have a little bit of patience, and you're also going to have access to a bunch of documents if you want to actually try this out and test it out. I now want to take a look at the trainable classifiers area in Microsoft Purview. So here we are on admin.microsoft.com. We're going to click Show All and then click on Compliance. Of course, we could also just go straight to purview.microsoft.com, which will bring us in right here. Now we're going to go to Information Protection, and then we're going to drop down where it says Classifiers, and that's where you're going to see Trainable Classifiers. All right. So once we get into trainable classifiers, the first thing you're going to notice is there is a bunch of these things. They tell you that you have built-in trainable classifiers, or you can also create custom ones. It says use the built-in or custom classifiers to identify specific categories of content based on existing items in your organization. Once created, classifiers can be used in several compliance solutions to detect related content and classify it, protect it, retain it, all that. So the idea being, of course, that we're going to use this to help detect certain types of content in our organization, and then from there we can classify it as sensitive or not sensitive, or maybe we want to classify it as vulgar, having profanity. Maybe we want to have retention labels applied to it, meaning, hey, we're going to retain this data for a certain amount of time, maybe a year or 5 years, and then it will be destroyed. That's the idea here. So you can kind of look through a bunch of these built-in classifiers. There's the profanity. You see profanity in different languages. And of course, you can click on these and you can see they talk about things like retention labels and all of that fun stuff. But these are built-in classifiers. Now, I can create my own. And if we go right here where it says create trainable classifier, so we give it a name, we'll just call it demo and click next. So here is the catch to all of this. They tell you that to learn how to classify content, the model needs samples that match the kind of document you want to classify, positive samples that will be used basically to compare against non-matching samples or negative samples. Each site should include between 50 and 500 files. Now, what are they talking about when they're talking about sites? Well, they're talking about SharePoint sites. So this is going to be a SharePoint thing, and they want you to have between 50 and 500 files. So they tell you if you include a site that contains more, we'll only process 500 of the most recently created files. Content must be written in English. Supported file types are going to include the Office documents, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, as well as PDF files, text files, and there are some other file types, and you can click the little link there if you want to see what that is. So, unfortunately, this is not something you can really demo here unless you've got between 50 and 500 files to throw in there. And then even then, it takes a long time for it to go through and build this trainable classifier. Ultimately, if that is something you want to try to attack and you've got 50 files or more to play around with, then feel free to do that. But ultimately, the main thing I needed you to take away from this video is this concept, understanding the idea of trainable classifiers here, and then remember the 50 to 500. Those are some things I would want you to remember, as well as the file types. Okay. Other than that, if you don't meet that criteria, you got to remember that, well, Microsoft does have, they've got their own built-in trainable classifiers, and you can always use those. Now, once you start implementing the sensitive information types and all of that in your environment, you start playing around with labels and all that stuff, Microsoft is going to start ingesting the data, and you will be able to sort of go through and take a look at what types of information in your environment is considered sensitive, as well as the activities that users are performing with that data. So I want to show you a little bit of that here and some of the ways we can monitor things. So here we are on admin.microsoft.com. I'm just going to click Show All, and I'm going to go down to Compliance. That'll bring me into purview.microsoft.com, which, as always, you could just type that in yourself if you want. And then we're going to go to Information Protection. All right, and then from there, I'm going to drop down where it says Explorers. So a couple things here. We have Data Explorer and we have Activity Explorer. Data Explorer is going to go through and it's going to tell us information that has been classified, labeled, is sensitive, and let us just sort of peruse all of the stuff that it's discovered in our environment. Activity Explorer is going to be used more in terms of seeing the activities the users have performed. All right. So we'll start with Data Explorer. Now, of course, in your lab environment, you're really not going to see a whole lot here as of right now. We're kind of introducing ourselves to this in this area, but until you really get some data and start playing around with it and more and more and more as you go through all of this, then you're going to start seeing some stuff populate. Now, in my case, you'll see I do have a few things showing up here just because I've used this tenant as time has gone on. Unfortunately, even for instructors, Microsoft doesn't allow us to have lots and lots of tenants. So I can't just create a free tenant every single time I create a course. So I do have some stuff here. But in your case, you're probably not going to see a whole lot here. But that's the beauty of all this. As you get deeper into all this, you start playing around more with the labels and all of that. Then I want you to come back into Data Explorer, and you're going to be able to see some of the stuff that's showing up. But that's the idea, though. Data Explorer is going to show you what has been found in your environment, anything that has been considered sensitive, classified, any of that is going to show up here. Even if you haven't started playing with labels and all that, once you start playing around with labels, though, you can come back and you can see this. All right. Now, if we go down to Activity Explorer, this is going to show you the activities that have been performed by people in your environment. And so from there, you can have it show you information based on a certain date. You've even got Copilot in here, set date. You can specify a certain activity that maybe somebody is performed. Based on, of course, you got to have some entries here for that to show up. And that's when you have users and all that are doing stuff. Unfortunately, it's hard to simulate all that in a lab environment. But in a real environment, obviously, you're going to have users that are doing things with their files. They're going to be opening and saving and writing over the top of the files and all that. So you'd see users here. You can see if there's any sensitivity labels. All of that will show up there. Now, for the time being, we also have the old Content Explorer Classic, which eventually is going to disappear. Wouldn't be surprised if you're watching this video and this is gone by now. But because, again, Microsoft changes these things about every week. All right. One more thing I want to show you when it comes to this, when it comes to ingesting data and allowing us to look through that data with Data Explorer and Activity Explorer. If we go over to Settings, we're going to click on Data Connectors, and then you've got what's called All Connectors, and you've got what's called My Connectors. Now, connectors allow us to ingest data from various things. If you go to All Connectors, you can see all these various connectors that Microsoft 365 is going to support. If you go to My Connectors, you can see any connectors that you have added specifically like into your environment that you want. So I could go right here, and I can see all these various connectors that I could set up. So this is great for scenarios where you want to ingest data that's maybe not just built into the Microsoft 365 environment. For example, Salesforce. Maybe I want to pull Salesforce data in. I could do that. And so you can kind of walk through step by step exactly how to set that connector up here. Okay. Main thing is I just want you to be aware of what a data connector is here and how it could be used in your environment if you needed to add ingest some custom data or some data from some other third-party product. That's going to be the way you do it. And of course, once you've done that, that'll also then begin showing up within your explorers here, Data Explorer as well as Activity Explorer. Now, something else that we can support when it comes to sensitive info types is the ability to scan OCR. That's optical character recognition. And the idea being that I might have files in my environment, like PDF files and all that, and I want it to be able to scan those files and look for sensitive information inside those files. Microsoft 365 has the ability to do that automatically, with the exception of one issue. You have to enable it, and when you enable it, it does cost money. First, let's take a look at the requirements of this, and then I'll show you how you could turn that on if you want to turn it on. So if we go to Google and we just search for these keywords, learn about optical character recognition in Microsoft Purview, you'll go to the link there. It'll bring you into this article, and they tell you the idea here. So the idea being that OCR is going to be used for scanning. You're utilizing Microsoft Purview to scan for sensitive information. This is going to look for all sorts of the same types of SIT information. In other words, sensitive information types that we've looked into. With the workflow at a glance, they tell you Azure subscription. You estimate your OCR scanning charges. You can do a pay-as-you-go, configure the scanning. Now, the prerequisites for this They tell you got to be a global admin. You need to verify pay-as-you-go with your Azure subscription. So you have to set that up. And the estimated cost is $1 for every 1,000 items that are scanned. And, of course, they tell you here it's going to scan JPG, PNG, BMP, all of that stuff. And they do tell you that each count is a single transaction. It also means that each page in a PDF file is charged separately. So that is definitely one of the catches there. You need to consider that if you got a 5,000 page PDF file that it's scanning, it's every page. So just consider that when you look at this. As far as permissions go, your account, they tell you used to create and deploy policies must be a member of one of the following groups: compliance administrator, compliance data administrator, global administrator, information protection admin. Global administrator, though, is the one that's going to activate this. All right. Where can you scan? You can scan Exchange, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, team chats and channel messages, and even devices themselves with these files. All right. These are the supported file types. It's all pretty straightforward. To turn this on, we're just going to go over to admin.microsoft.com, click Show All, click Compliance. Of course, we could also just type straight into purview.microsoft.com. And then from there, we're going to go to Settings, and this is where you'll see OCR. All right. So you can then go and activate this. This is not something that we really need to dive in and demo because of the cost factor. They do have a 30-day free trial and all that, but there isn't really anything special to see here. All it does is it activates this feature, and then at that point, you have the ability for your environment to scan those types of files. There isn't really much hands-on there. The key things I would take away from this video, if I'm going to say, okay, these are the things you want to remember, you need to remember that the global admin is the one that can activate this, okay? You have to have an Azure subscription, and then as far as permissions goes, these various groups are the ones that have access to handle it, and then these are the different locations that we can scan. Other than that, there isn't really a lot of hands-on I would worry about on this. Just be aware of those facts that I've given you. Now, as we begin learning about sensitivity labels, the first step in all of that is understanding the roles and permissions that are going to be used for being able to administer sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels obviously is going to play a very important role when you're working in conjunction with Microsoft 365, Microsoft Purview, and all that. You've got to be able to label information as sensitive and then restrict things based on policies, data loss prevention, all of that. And this is a critical part of your compliance infrastructure. Now, but we need to understand the roles that Microsoft has provided, which is going to control the permissions that will be used for administering it. So right here on this this image, I want to show you that there are three main role groups that you'll use in Purview, and then there's also some subgroups that I'll show you with this as well. The first is the compliance administrator. That role group will give full access to manage compliance features. This will include sensitivity labels, label policies, DLP, and all that fun stuff. You can create, publish, edit sensitivity labels and policies if you are a compliance administrator. Then you've got information protection admin. The information protection admin, this is scoped for managing Microsoft information protection with the sensitivity labels, all of that fun stuff. So MIP, or Microsoft Information Protection, all this is included if you are an information protection admin. And of course, anytime you see the word admin there or administrator, you're going to have power for creating, configuring, and publishing things. Now, one thing they do mention here, you cannot manage broader compliance features outside of information protection. So you're sort of restricted within the information protection area, as opposed to the compliance admin that can expand that. All right. So then you have information protection admin, but then you have information protection analyst. This is a read-only access to your sensitivity labels and label usage analytics. You cannot create or modify labels or policies with that. Something else, optionally, another thing to consider here is if you are if you are a security administrator or a global administrator, then you can also administer the labels as well. but it's best practice to use the more specific roles that you see there. Now, I also want to point out that you have these three main roles, but then there's also some sub-roles. And so that is going to be the information protection investigators. That's the first one. And the purpose of this is primarily for investigating how sensitivity labels and the related protection settings are going to be used across your organization. So your access there would be to be able to view label activity, user actions, in tools like the Activity Explorer and Content Explorer. You can also view encrypted content as well. So if granted the Content Explorer Content Viewer role or similar with the role-based access control permissions. You cannot create, edit, or publish sensitivity labels or policies. So that's one sub-role. The next sub-role is information protection readers. So this is a read-only visibility role when it comes to sensitivity label configuration and reporting. The access you're going to get, you can view sensitivity, label definitions, label policies, label usage analytics. You can also access the Microsoft Purview portal to see how labels are being applied across your content. What you cannot do is modify any labels or policies. All right, and then I've also got this nice little table right here to the right, sort of breaks it all down for you with these various roles, what they can and cannot do. All right. So now that we've gone through some of the concepts here, let me show you how you would implement these roles. So here I am on admin.microsoft.com, and I'm just going to click Show All, and we'll go down here to Compliance, which is going to bring us into purview.microsoft.com. Of course, you could just type that directly into your URL bar and go straight there. Once I'm in Microsoft Purview, I'm going to go right here to Settings, and then I'm going to drop down where it says Roles and Scopes. So the first thing of note here is you'll see that you have the Microsoft Entra ID roles. This, of course, links back to Microsoft Entra ID, and you'll see that we have this right here, the Global Administrator role, and then the Security Administrator role, right? And, of course, we know that those two roles are two of the roles that we talked about that have access to utilize sensitivity labels and all that. But the main roles we want to look at are the ones directly involved in the information protection. We're going to find that by going over here to role groups. All right. And if we scroll down, we'll see these various roles. Actually, let's resort that. There we go. Now that's better. So you'll see these roles right here: information protection admins, analysts, investigator. You can see these four roles listed here. And of course, I can click on each one of those if I want, right? I can edit those role groups. You can see right there. Select edit, and this is where I could say choose users and select a user. So like John Christopher, for example, in my case, next, and then save. And that's how I can add to the role groups. So that is where you're going to see these various role groups that are available, and that's how you add a user to the role group. Now, you might also notice that there is a role group called just information protection, and that just encompasses, if you give somebody this role, they get access to all of this right here. If you click that, you'll see that. You also get access to some other role groups based on this. So you want to give even more power. This will get into data classification, all that, then that would be the role group that you would utilize. That's just a sort of, it's a more powerful group really than all of these groups here. But I would focus, if I were you, focus more on these four here, because Microsoft is all about giving least amount of privileges that gives just the rights that somebody needs. And that's going to be the important thing to remember here. So I would focus more on these four roles, knowing these four roles, than anything else. Now also, lastly, you can create your own role group. Come here, just give it a name, click next, and then you can choose, you can mix and match the roles that you want into this role group itself. So that's another option that you've got as far as dealing with role groups. All right. But ultimately, hopefully this video has helped you get a better understanding of what the various role groups that are available for giving permission when it comes to sensitivity labels.
Now I want to get into the concept now of sensitivity labels. It's important if you are going to start dealing with your data governance, compliance, that you have a decent understanding of sensitivity labels and how these sensitivity labels are going to get applied. And we want to start out just by getting a basic understanding of what these things are. So what are sensitivity labels? So sensitivity labels are going to be used to help my organization, business organizations, whatever, be able to determine and identify what is considered sensitive information. And of course, we have what are known as sensitive info types, and sensitive info types allow us to recognize the sensitive information. But then we need to create what's known as a sensitivity label so that we can apply rules and conditions and determine, if we should have something labeled and classified so that we can apply other rules to that, such as data loss prevention rules, which is going to do things like preventing somebody from sharing data that shouldn't be shared if it's got a certain sensitivity label applied to it. These sensitivity labels can be manually applied by your users, and you can also have rules that automate this process as well. But users can manually apply these to documents, emails, all that good stuff as well. Now, how labels actually get applied, how labels apply with sensitivity, that's going to involve the documents themselves or emails. Those are your two big things. You want to be thinking in regards to all the different ways that we work with documents, whether it's SharePoint, Teams, we've got OneDrive, we've got Exchange Online, our email services. Not only that, but we also have applications that we've installed on our local computer. So one thing I want to clarify right out of the gates here, let's go ahead and get this out in the open. A lot of people think that, these labels are only going to work if the document or whatever is out in the cloud. Technically, these labels can be downloaded to local machines that are associated with our Microsoft 365 cloud services. And if you got the proper licensing, it'll apply down to their local installed Office products as well. So Word, Excel, all of that, Outlook, all of that is going to have this stuff applied, these rules applied even locally on people's machines. So it's not just, the online versions of these apps, but it's also the downloaded or installed versions of these locally on your computer as well. And mobile platforms also. So these sensitivity labels can be applied. You can have classified information that gets these labels put on it, and the labels can be visually watermarked, such as with a header or footer, or you have a diagonal watermark that goes along the screen as well, which I'll show you here in just a moment. Here's the basic flow of using labels. So an administrator is going to create the sensitivity labels that they want. Basically set up how they want things to be labeled. They're going to publish these sensitivity labels in what's called a label policy. The policy can be applied to specific users or groups. Okay, so pretty simple idea. You create the label, you set up the policy that's going to apply to users and groups. Now, the end user themselves are going to be able to utilize these via email products, Outlook, whatever. Whether it's Outlook on the web or if it's the downloadable or installed version of Outlook, mobile version of Outlook. And then you also have documents with this as well, where your documents themselves, Word, Excel, all that fun stuff, can have labels associated as well. All right. And so it's the end user can interact with all of this and have documents classified with these labels that they want. So if I had a label that was, called top secret or something, or business confidential or something along those lines, I could have that available to the user so they can apply it to the actual product itself, to the actual document through the product itself. Okay, so Office or third-party app services can have enforced protection settings that get put on it. And this can all tie into data loss prevention policies, and we can have automated things happen where the labels get automatically applied and rules get applied that force things to be encrypted or stop a user from sharing data and basically give us a bigger measure of control over our data. Now here is the licensing requirements. Basically the key word here is, or the key number I should say, is the number 5. You want to have any of the E5, A5, G5, and even F5 with F5 compliance will give you what you need for a user. So your users will have to in order to really interact and associate classification, sensitivity labels, and all that in a product, they must have one of these licenses that you see here in these 5 bullet points. All right. So keep that in mind. You would need to make sure that you've got licenses for one of these associated with your users before they can really take advantage of sensitivity labels. Assigning sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels are customizable. You can go in and create and name them what you want. And there's different settings and all that you can apply there. There's here some examples of that would be things like personal, public, general, confidential, highly confidential, and you could come up with some others based on your business. These are clear text labels, so they get applied in clear text, and they're part of the metadata of the file. So they get associated with the metadata of the file, which is really cool because it also means that third-party products that can understand the metadata sensitivity label tags and all that, they can recognize it as well. So it's not just only Office that supports it. Other products can support it as well. And then these also, they have a persistency to them. So the labels are stored as part of the metadata. They're not part of the actual payload of the data itself, like the document itself. It's associated as metadata, which is connected to that. So you can have you can basically have this associated in the metadata, and you can have policies that apply to it based on that metadata. If you look in the little image I've got for you here, you'll see that the user is looking at Outlook, and you'll see that the message right there on that email, it's flagged as public. So this is public information, has a sensitivity label associated with it saying that it's public. All right. And finally, what sensitivity labels can do? Well, again, you can apply rules to sensitivity labels. These rules are going to make it where I can have things like encryption rules where a document is going to be forcibly encrypted, and this will tie in with data loss prevention and all that to do that. There's a feature called rights management that we have supported that does the encryption for us. And great thing about it is it encrypts your data in all 3 states. So it encrypts the data when it's at rest, in use, and in transit, which means that even if somebody copies it somewhere, or maybe they accidentally send it to somebody that they weren't supposed to send it to, the document's going to be encrypted. So even if it somehow managed to get on a flash drive, or it got emailed to somebody or copied somewhere, it's going to be encrypted in all the different states that it's being used in. The other thing is you can watermark it. You can do marking, and that's what you're seeing in the little image here. You'll see that it has a marking on it. You've got watermarks, headers, footers, and then you can have that little background watermark that you see there. It says highly confidential that can show up on all the pages of the document. So that's another nice little feature about it. The other thing that I don't have shown here is that you can have these things called policy tips where whenever your system automates the process of locating that it needs to be a label on that document, you can have a little message that pops up on the screen that tells the user that they should probably set a sensitivity label for this document. And that's one of the neat things about sensitivity labels is the automation side of all of this. Some of it can be automated where when sensitive information gets discovered, you get a policy tip that basically says, hey, you need to, this document needs to be labeled as sensitive. And of course, if you mix this with data loss prevention, you can force that sort of thing to happen so that a user, whether they do it or not, it's going to be enforced. So all in all, sensitivity labels is a really powerful feature that we can utilize in our environment to basically set these labels up so that they can be applied by our users or even automated. And with that, we can set restrictions based on those labels.
I now want to jump in and see how we can define and manage our sensitivity labels in Microsoft Purview. Now, I do want to warn you that there's going to be stuff that we look at here where I'm not going to explain every single checkbox or whatever on the screen at the time because, well, that's going to be in multiple videos. So you're not going to learn every single thing there is to learn in this one video about sensitivity labels, but it's going to be broken up into pieces. So I just wanted to kind of forewarn you on that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Here we go. We're on admin.microsoft.com. We're going to click Show All. Then we're going to go to compliance. That's going to bring us into Microsoft Purview, which is purview.microsoft.com. As always, you could just go straight to that URL if you want. Now I'm going to click on information protection, and then from there we've got a blade called sensitivity labels. So we're going to go ahead and click on that. Keep in mind, you may not see the exact same stuff that I've got on my screen here, and this is because of the fact that I have used my Microsoft 365 tenant for various courses over the years. I'm not able to create a new trial tenant every single time I create a new course. So just heads up on that. You may not see the same stuff as me. That's okay. We're going to go ahead now. We're going to take a look at create a label. All right. So they tell you here, the protection settings you choose for this label will be immediately enforced on the items or content containers to which it's applied. So labeled files will be protected however they go, whether they're saved in the cloud or downloaded to a computer. So this information, the metadata, all that stuff that stays associated with any files that are flagged as, are labeled, I should say, with these sensitivity labels. So as far as the name goes, you could give it whatever name you want. I'm going to say top secret data. That's going to be the name of this label. Then give it a display name. I'm just going to copy that, give it the same name. By default, they tell you that the label will be assigned as the highest priority, but you can change this after if you want. Okay. Description to users. You could give a description to users. You could also give a description to admins, however you want to do it. Also, let me kind of warn you, I know you might have heard me say this before, Microsoft changes these screens, it feels like almost weekly. So don't be surprised if your screen looks a little different than mine. As always, it's understanding the concepts here is very important, as opposed to having to memorize what a screen looks like. You just got to get used to the fact that Microsoft changes these screens almost weekly, even in the real world. Even if I update my videos every day, I doubt I can keep up with them. All right, so anyway, what color do you want this to be? I'm going to go with this red color. All right, the label will be this little red color is what it'll be tagged with. Then we'll click next. All right, from there, they want you to define the scope for the label. They tell you that labels can be applied to data sets, to data assets and containers like SharePoints, Teams, all that fun stuff. But they tell you, let us know where you want this label to be used so you can show you, so we can show you related protection settings. So they want to know, like, where exactly is this label going to be associated with. And by default, you've got files and other data assets, so label files and data assets in Microsoft 365, the Microsoft Fabric, Power BI, Azure, all that. Then you've got emails, so label messages sent from all versions of Outlook. And then meetings, label calendar events, meeting schedules in Outlook and Teams. And then you've got groups and sites. Now keep in mind that when you first come in here with groups and sites, this may be grayed out. This may be something you have to enable, and if it is something you have to enable in your environment, there will be a little link that you can click on to enable it. I'm not going to be doing groups and sites right now, so I'm going to leave that alone. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and click Next. It says choose protection settings for the types of items you selected. So the protection settings they tell you configure will be enforced when the label is applied to items in Microsoft 365. So what am I wanting to do here? Control access, so control who can access and view labeled items. So I could select that if I want. All right. Apply content marking, so add custom headers, footers, and watermarks to labeled items. If I wanted to do that, go ahead and have watermarks. I'm not going to get into that right now. And then I've got protect Teams meetings and chats, configure protections for Teams meetings and chats and all that. All right, we're just going to say control access for right now. We'll click Next. Okay, then it says access control. Use encryption capabilities to control who can access labeled items depending on the scope you specified. All right, so right now I could say remove access control settings if already applied to items, or the default already says configure access control. So I could say assign permissions now or let user decide. So you could go ahead and assign some permissions, meaning what permissions that you want to allow, or you could allow the user who is applying this label, if they're manually applying it, they could decide what that's going to be. All right. So you can decide which of these options you want. It says user access to content expires. Right now it says never. I could have it expire on a specific date. I could also allow offline access, meaning a person could download the file, like say to a laptop, and then maybe they don't even have an internet connection. They could still access the file even when it's offline. Of course, you can also make it where that they're not allowed to do it offline, which means you have to have an internet connection. They've got to be authenticated and all that when they open it up. All right. Here's where you can assign permissions to who you want to assign it to. So I could go through here and choose, a certain permission: owner, editor, restricted, editor, viewer. You can do custom. You can select the kinds of things they can do here. All right. And then you could go ahead and just specify which users this is going to apply to, right? So I'll just say John Christopher, select me, add, there you go, permissions, and I'll say owner, save. All right. I'm not going to do watermarking or any encryption right now. I'm going to click next. I'm not going to do auto labeling or any of that right now. I'm going to click next. And then I can also define protection settings for groups and sites. I'm not going to get into that here, but if I wanted to, I could say I could do privacy and external use, user access, meaning people that are outside the organization, like guests who are using access. That's what that's going to affect. External sharing and conditional access, that also is if you're sharing things like SharePoint site data and all of that outside the organization. And then also private teams discoverability and shared channel. If you want to restrict that with anything that's labeled here, you could do that by selecting these checkboxes. In my case, I am going to click next, and then at that point, I'm going to create the label. All right. Now, let me warn you that when you go through the process of creating labels, it's sometimes with Microsoft 365, especially in a lab environment, this is hit or miss on how quickly this will be available. Okay. Even when you go and you publish it, which I'm not going to publish just yet, but it can sometimes take up to 24 hours before the labels are actually available for use by users and all that. So just kind of be advised on that, especially if you got a trial subscription and all that. It takes longer. If you've got a real tenant and all that, a lot of times it'll happen within the first hour. Okay, so then it asks me if I want to go ahead and publish. So this is where you're gonna publish it and start using it. I don't want to do that just yet. I'm going to choose don't create the policy yet. That the policy is where you'll be publishing it, so it becomes available and all that. Right now, in this video, all I wanted to do was create the label. Only other thing I'll mention here is that if you have multiple sensitivity labels, you'll notice that there is a priority, and you can move up or move down based on priority. This is what happens when you have multiple labels that conflict for any reason. You have this priority, and as you can see, the higher the number is the higher priority in this case, which is kind of weird. In the Microsoft world, in some cases, you'll find it's the lower the number that's got the higher priority. In this case, it's the higher the number that's got the higher priority. So it's a little different than what we see in some of the Microsoft applications and settings. So anyway, that's what priority is. If there's ever a conflict, the higher the number higher listed there is the higher the priority. So right now, top secret data has the highest priority.
Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.